Hello all, Tom here from Made on Jupyter with a little demo of the new uh, object selection mechanisms that we have in Spoke Creator. Uh, so we've got a few objects here, we call them primitives. Essentially they're just there's a NURBS curve here, and there's some polygons. And so what we've done now is create a node that's called primitive selection. And what that does, it just takes the input geometry and it creates a Boolean for every primitive object that comes in. You can actually check what primitives come in to a node just by doing a right mouse button and show info. You can see, it might be a bit small in the video, there's 3 polymeshes and an NURBS curve coming in here, as we can see here. And so this primitive selection node, if we switch on the color at least, will show you, which object is selected, and you can now pick curves as well as polygons. And you can see that the corresponding Boolean here lights up in the Boolean mask, and that Boolean mask then gets exported here as the selection mask property, and also the last selected, the index of the last selected object is exported here, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff with that. I'll show you that in a second. So this is a basic primitive selection. This doesn't really allow you to do much with the objects, so we have a little more interesting example here at top. So we have a few objects coming in here. We have our bunny again, a polycircle, a star, and I think if we collect those, it looks something like this. And what we've done is, instead of a primitive selection node, we now have what's called a transform selected, which is basically a transform node merged in with a primitive selection node. And so when that is used, you can do the following. You can essentially just select an object and move it around individually per object, essentially. And so that's all good, and essentially it stores the translate, rotate, and scale values, uniform scale, etc. per object. And again, it spits out a selection mask for you to do stuff with it past this node. So we've done something a little more complex here. So these primitive selection nodes and this transform selection node work on single primitives. Now what happens if you have something like this? You have, let's say, 3 curves, and you want to consider that as a group. Well, this is a one technique to help you kind of deal with that, and this works very well for 2D shapes, especially if they've been laid out nicely next to each other, just like here. And what we're doing here essentially is taking, in this case, all the curve geometry, all this geometry here, and we are piping this in what we call a Barry deform. Now, Barry deform is in itself a node that's built up of other basic nodes, but what it does, it takes geometry just like this, and does 2 things with it. Essentially, it takes that geometry, binds it to some base geometry like this, and then you deform that base geometry like that, and it will basically drag along anything that's attached to that base geometry. So basically we're attaching these curves here to this geometry, we're binding it to that, and then we move the underlying geometry like that, and the curves basically get dragged along. And what this allows you to do is basically create groups of objects, like the bunny and the 2 eyes here, and they will be moved in unison. So again, this breaks free from the limitation of being able to select and move only single primitives using this technique. And if we combine the whole thing, we end up with something like this. So we have the camera and we shift select the transform. Now because the geometry of the transform is not directly connected to the camera here, we can't see the geometry in there. But we can see the Barry deform, which is connected directly here. So we can see the resulting curves being dragged around by the geometry underneath. And as you can see, I've done something extra here. For any object that's selected, we fill it with the polygon geometry. So, and how does that work? Well, that uses the mask that comes out of transform selected here. So again, a transform selected is exporting a bit mask. Let's see if we can see it here somewhere in the output. There we go. So in this case, we have 2 of the 3 incoming objects selected, you can see. And this gets piped into delete primitives. So this is geometry that comes out of it. And we pipe that geometry into delete primitives, and we're deleting based on a mask. And that mask also comes from transform selected, and that's that selection mask that we just saw before. So in this case, we have 2 objects selected, so the bunny in this case will be deleted out of this section. We made the call a little more dim and pipe that as well into the camera. So what we end up with is something like this, where if this is shift selected, that you can click anywhere in the area, the bounding area of these curves, and move things around. And of course we can also rotate. So that's a bit of an update on some of the primitive or object selection tools that we have.